You're listening to Claiming Space, a show that holistically questions our pursuits of new frontiers, centered around the social sciences. In the space industry, Claiming Space features diverse voices and perspectives, with a specific focus on digital economies in space ecosystems. We talk to experts from a wide range of sectors in social sciences, technology, and the arts that affect not only our daily lives on Earth, but also beyond, that are parables to each other. I'm your host, Vikram. Today we have Dr. Brent Ryan Bellamy. Brent is a writer, editor, instructor who is most fulfilled by helping students and collaborators achieve their vision in a collective way. He loves teaching a university level course on world building, for instance. He's also the managing editor of Imaginations, a journal of cross-cultural image studies, and the author of several scholarly articles and book chapters about science fiction, energy regimes, and how to imagine a better future. Brent lives in Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishnabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The city is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Check out his piece, latest piece in Public Book Systems and Futures section called How to Build a World. Hey, Brent, welcome to Claiming Space. It's really excited to have you here today. What inspired you to get into what you're doing right now? Has it always been something you've been interested in as a kid? Or?
Yeah, it's funny. As a kid, I was really interested in fantasy novels, fantasy spaces, that whole side of things. But I found as I was like at university and starting to read, I took a class in science fiction and it captured my imagination. And so once I started doing my doctorate at the University of Alberta, I knew that I wanted science fiction to be a part of it. And it's only my sort of like bringing together of my academic thinking and then political thinking has merged around science fiction more and more in recent years.
Okay, cool. So there's like, some fascinating stuff you're doing. I'm gonna be asking a lot of dumb questions, mostly because I'm not a humanities or arts background. So could you tell us a bit about energy humanities? Like, what does energy humanities research involves?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked about that because I think even to myself, the kind of pillars of my research and teaching might seem a little bit strange. So like American literature and culture, science fiction, and energy humanities. Energy humanities is a growing field that takes a look at anything from the fossil regime, fossil systems, and just energy systems in general, across geographies, across history, and looks at the more humanistic side of it. It's motivated quite a bit by the ongoing climate crisis. And one of the core kind of tenets of energy humanities would be that any transition to a new energy regime needs to be social and cultural as well as technical and economic and political. So basically that we have so many engineered solutions to our kind of energy demands, but we're not seeing them implemented at nearly the rate that's necessary. And so energy humanities is sort of they're asking like, well, what is it? How do energy transitions take place? What do people have to know in order for this to happen? And it sort of traces some of these environmental issues, energy issues down to the social and the cultural level.
Okay, so does that like involve? So just to like kind of for me to picture it, so does that mean like when you're making sort of decisions when it comes to whether it's whether it's state level decisions or whether it's like say corporations, and they're involved in the fossil fuel industry, or in some sort of energy that is of extractive nature, you get people who, all the stakeholders or all the people involved in that sort of ecosystem involved in the conversation, even if they do not benefit from it directly? Or is that?
Oh, that would be an ideal place to come at this from. I can give you an example of how energy humanities plays out in my own research, and then also maybe in my teaching.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that we've started to think about energy, and when we say energy humanity, when I say that energy humanities word, I really mean like there are social scientists, literary scholars, cultural scholars, people who work in the arts, in fine arts, and in design, who are coming together from lots of different backgrounds. So it can be many different things. For me, it means specifically reading science fiction to try and get a handle on how we can live together differently, how we can reimagine our relationships as ones that are animated by energy, and to try and like think through that problem of like how do we go from knowing something to doing something about it. I think that's one of the animating things in the research itself. Now, in terms of teaching, I teach a university level class, and I have the students, an English class, but I have the students do these energy inventories.
Yeah. So
they just basically write down everything they use in a day, and then think about like, are there fossil fuel related products in these things? Are there how much energy is my cell phone using when I have it plugged in? And then where is that energy coming from? Where do I live? Is it hydropower? Is it a coal plant? So they start to trace through their own lives the places that energy shows up. And surprise, it's mostly like in the bathroom and in the kitchen. And they start to realize like, oh, they start thinking like, I need to change my habits. I need to think about this a little bit differently. At which point I say, well, go and, read the work your classmates are posting in our like course space, because you're all sort of saying the same thing. Look, we're all caught in this energy system together. We have very, very little choice over it, actually, unless we start to educate ourselves and start to find ways to engage and collectively make better energy decisions.
Okay. All right. So is that what you mean by energy literacy? So in other words, you're just helping people to think about it first in pretty much everything sort of they do in life.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. There's an easy aha moment to get with the class where they're things that they know they've been using all the time, but they haven't really had to ask questions about them. And once they start, then I can turn them towards the literature or towards film to say like, oh, now can you see this happening in the background here? Because they've now seen it in the background of their own lives, and they start to draw these connections and understand global relations in a new way. I have them do commodity chains as well, as part of their coursework.
What do you mean by commodity chains? Is this like how they're all connected, or?
Yeah, so they start off picking an object that they purchased recently, and then they go away and do their own kind of research into it to see like, like I pity the students that pick their laptop, because they're like, actually, I think I need to do 20 different chains, or maybe 30 for all the components and like where the material is extracted from that goes into building part A and part B. But some people pick things like their fake plant or their toothbrush or gum or something, and then they can kind of trace, oh, actually, like the local produce I picked up from the farmer's market is not from very far away. And so that's a kind of easy chain versus like buying a cup of coffee from the global coffee enterprise,
Yeah.
Which has a much more complicated route to get to your hand.
Okay, cool. So I didn't know what a loanword was until today. So it's when one adopts a word from one language into another language without the translation. Did I understand that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you
exactly?
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit more?
Stepping on you there.
No, it's all right.
Yeah. So yeah, this ties in a little bit to the energy question in that I did this project that's environmentally motivated, and it's called an Ecotopian Lexicon. And we took the idea of the loan word. So in English, chocolate is a loan word. Or now I'm just like, oh, ecstasy is a loan word from ancient Greek. These words that we just kind of have borrowed. I don't think there's any intention that we're going to return them at any point, but that's part of the way the word works. So we invited Matthew Schneider-Mayerson, my collaborator, and I invited people to propose loan words that would be useful for environmental struggles. And here again, you can see, like, with the environmental or energy humanities, this project is like, oh, we need a new language in order to imagine an ecotopian future. That's sort of the impetus. So people came up with some really compelling terms with some, and it's interesting, like people will sometimes ask, like, oh, are we supposed to use these words? And this is a good humanities trick. It's to say, like, well, which ones would you want to use and why? Like, I'm not sure. It's an experiment. But I can give you an example of a loan word here. I just want to sort of pick one. I'll pick the kind of most out of left field one. So Melody Jew, who is a humanities scholar who works on oceans, wrote one that is squiggle asterisk squiggle. That's the word. And it's meant to symbolize a word, or not a word necessarily, but the way that ocean mammals communicate. So dolphins will do this thing where they buzz each other in the water. And so the way to replicate this word is to blow air across the back of your hand. Like, that's how to pronounce it. But she writes this piece about, she ties it to our cellular devices, to the kind of vibration or buzz, when we kind of ping each other. And it's just like this beautiful meditation on the assumptions that we make about communication, and the ways that we actually, through technology, do adapt these dolphinese terms that kind of circulate. If I can give another example, Daniel Warden, who's a comic scholar, he writes on graphic fiction, writes on the term sibopathic from the comic series Chew. And a sibopath is someone who, when they eat something, knows the history of that thing. Which ties right into commodity chains in a sense, because this detective will show up on a crime scene and taste something and then know what happened. But Daniel Warden has this great moment where he was like, that means in our world, if one was a sibopath, everything we would taste like corn and oil.
So on dogs, technically in that category, because like every time they smell, they can get, that's how because they don't really have a sense of like, I don't like, from personal experience being a dog, they seem to like only be in like the moment, like in that present moment, but they seem to know about things by where something has been in the past through its smell. Is that, I mean, I don't know.
I think absolutely. especially dogs that like have been bred to be really effective trackers.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That, right, this is sort of like smelling something and then getting a sense of where it's come from, but that magnified is what he's talking about.
Okay.
And here you can see there's like both examples are an imaginative intervention on how we might think about our day-to-day lives, or in a similar way to the energy inventory I was talking about earlier.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So in other words, like trying to figure out, so doing that the carbon chain or the energy chain that you mentioned earlier. Okay, cool. Could you explain a bit about the Ecotopian Lexicon and how it relates to climate futures?
Yeah, so this Ecotopian Lexicon,
Ecotopian, sorry. Lexicon.
Yeah. The idea, again, it's like, so we got many contributors. There's 30 loanwords. There's visual art in it. People can go to an Ecotopian Lexicon. I want to say.com. I should know my own website. But you can, I think it should be fairly easy to find and to see some art that was produced, original pieces for this work. The intervention, the climate news is just so dire day to day. And I think we know it. We're inundated with it. This isn't a book about denying that. Like this book kind of starts from that point, and then tries to offer some possibilities. One of our contributors describes it really eloquently as Janet Tamalik McGrath, as a bridge, but that's built out of ice.
Right.
So it's like we have this opportunity to try to come together and figure things out, but we're not quite sure what it's gonna require. And so this is like an experiment in trying to get some lateral thinking going. It's not prescriptive. It's not like if you use these words, things will get better. It's not naive like that, but there is a kind of hope that we'll just shake up the thinking a little bit, see things from another perspective.
So is it like, I guess if you learn to adopt the, at least what we think might be the right words, when it comes to us like being more aware every day about our climate, that we eventually sort of like instinctually or habitually change our habits? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I would say habits are just so central to all of this. Yeah. And I think part of the work that I see science fiction doing and the work that we're trying to do with this book is to kind of get everybody's way of thinking about the world more in sync than it is already. So having this sort of like unfamiliar term to kind of like meditate on it and try to think about how you might put it into practice. Or even one of the great things about this text is often people will say, well, does it have this word in it or that word in it? Like people can think of other words really quickly. And the book actually started as a kind of game that we were playing. Like, what are some terms from science fiction that aren't really widely used, but could be helpful to think about ecological struggles? And so that's what we're trying to do. So some terms might be really useful and expedient and direct, whereas others will be more to shake up thinking a little bit, to see things in a new way or sense things in a new way.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to RPGs. So you are a multi-game master where you build a world with other players and own a bar. Could you explain a little bit more? Because that sounds interesting.
Yeah. We at the start of the quarantine, I wasn't going to be able to travel to teach anymore. I was going to be teaching from home, and so I wasn't going to be able to get together with my game group.
Yeah.
And one of my friends wrote, was like, we got to get like an online thing going on. So we got together, and we're like, well, we're all burnt out, but we want this to happen. And so it kind of just came about that we decided we would create a setting. Are you familiar with Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke, the anime film?
No.
It's awesome. If that's your thing, it's super great. It's we basically there's a town there called Irontown, which is a frontier town.
Yeah.
A mining town, extractive town. And there's these forest spirits, giant wolves, giant boars that are threatening it. Anyway, we kind of were inspired by that film, and we're like, let's make an Iron Town, but we'll play a bunch of basically like fantasy communists who own this bar called the Red Flagon.
Yeah.
And we'll take turns running adventures each week. And so we've been kind of playing for a year now.
Okay.
Developing things.
So like what sort of are you using a platform, or is it more like so how are you guys playing it? Or is it more like Dungeons and Dragons kind of thing?
It is Dungeons and Dragons that we're playing. Right. Yeah, we're playing on a virtual tabletop playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Okay, cool. So I came across an article you and Sean O'Brien wrote titled Solar Accumulations, the World Systems Theory of the Expanse, which blew my mind. So mostly because I know nothing about humanities and arts, but I liked how you used the world systems theory, which I also did not know back when I first read it. So I had to learn what that was, and then sort of compare, and how you compare the world today and the world in Expanse. So maybe we could probably start with what world systems theory is in the context of political economy. Like, the idea of core and then peripheral nations and semi-core and all that stuff.
All that stuff. Yeah, I'll try to do it in as clear a way as possible. But so essentially there is sociologist Giovanni Arrighi. That's who I learned world systems theory from reading his works. He was sort of like basing his work on a historian, Ferdinand Brodel, who wrote about these cycles of accumulation in the Mediterranean, right? Like the basic idea is that there's a phase, the beginning of an economic cycle where things are ramping up. Then there's a kind of peak. And then there's this moment at the end where you see expanded financialization of products. So like we can think right away of the Dutch cycle. It ends with a kind of crisis, the tulip crisis, tulip futures. There's that whole thing. But Arrighi is trying to understand what's going on in the US cycle. And he's writing this before the 2007-2008 financial crisis too. But he's starting to try to figure that out. So he writes this book, The Long 20th Century, about it. But he realizes in order to get that, he'll have to go back to Genoa, go back to the Dutch cycle, and then go back to the British cycle, right? Like kind of proposes these 4 cycles that we see. So it's like a macroscopic historical, political, economic analysis. He's also very interested in power and territory as well. Okay, so that's basically, like Arrighi says, here's how the modernity has worked, like the last 400, 500 years in these long centuries, where we see one power rise up, and then we see it hit this sort of financial crisis, and then another cycle begins somewhere else with another center of power, which also would have another periphery, like you're mentioning. But what does this have to do with space? But what does this have to do with the expanse? So what it has to do is that my my colleague Sean O'Brien and I was like, you have to watch this show with me. And as we were watching it, the first couple times we were like, whoa, we're just like doing that. We were geeking out about political economy as we're watching the science fiction TV show. That's kind of one of the things we do for fun. And then we just made this joke because it's called world systems theory, but then we were thinking of fictional worlds. And so we said worlds systems theory, and we're like, dude, that's so good. Let's write a piece about this. That's the genesis of these kind of things. We're like, this will be so fun. And we kind of just worked through the show because one of the things that the show does is present, I don't know how many people will be familiar with it, but it's based on a series of novels and novellas as well. And it also was like a sci-fi show, and now it's on Amazon. And to be completely honest, I'm not caught up on it at the moment. So I'll just talk about the piece though. So it does this thing where it's like projecting this future world, but future solar system where Mars has been colonized, Earth is still holding on, and there's the moon, and that's kind of one unit. Mars is a kind of military colony, and then there's this asteroid belt has been populated as well. And so it kind of looks like a 3 worlds model, right? Like you have the Earth, Mars, and the belt mirroring the first, second, and third world, but in space. And so we were just interested in seeing what would happen if we really thought about what it meant to imagine the next cycle of accumulation, right? Because it's set in the near future. What if the next cycle is outer space, right? Like, what if that is where capital gets kick-started to have another cycle of accumulation? And it's this sort of weird, science fiction's great because you get to look at it as the fiction, and then you also at the same time get to look at it as what that fiction represents. And both can kind of be true at once. So we're reading it as a kind of show that is grappling with this contradiction of another cycle of accumulation, with the environmental costs of that, with the political costs of that, with what people are being the most impacted, right? And in the show, it's the belters who are struggling to survive on these asteroids, and they're kind of caught between the power moves of Earth and Mars. And of course, the series shakes that all up as it goes on, but it's interesting how it sort of sets itself up in this way that really evokes our political economy of our current conjuncture.
Because when I first tried to figure out what world systems theory was, I was quite it was quite interesting because I can't remember the author, the person's name who came up with the theory, but it was quite interesting in the way he it sort of came out from his from, I guess, his literature review of systems theory and systems thinking. So from an engineering and science perspective, systems thinking is one of the bases of systems engineering, which is used in the engineering field. And so looking at, the way he constructed world systems theory was a way to treat the planet as a complex system, and where you have all these intricate parts that you have multiple scales, and like your macro, meso, and your micro scales. And then you have your different actors where you have your core, and then you have your periphery. So your core, like your wealthy nations, and in the case of Expanse was Earth and maybe Mars. Earth and Mars. And then you have the less wealthy countries or peripheral countries whose resources or like kind of benefit in some way the core countries like the Belters in the case of. So yeah, I found that quite fascinating. And you're right. Like the show The Expanse is very relevant to like what's happening in the world today, from a climate perspective, from geopolitics, as well as like issues related to like like the global financial crisis. I would even say that. So it's like it's definitely a good paper to read, I thought. And I think I remember a line where I'm just paraphrasing, I can't really find it at the moment, but where you say how like humanity on the Expanse goes and tries to conquer the stars because they're trying to escape a problem that they created on Earth itself, which is the climate problem. But in fact, they're creating another problem, which is pretty much the same thing in the solar system. So it's kind of like this cycle. So yeah, I found that quite interesting as well.
Yeah. I'm glad that it sounds like some of the fun that we were having putting the piece together comes through. So I'm glad to hear that. I'm curious to hear more about, was it Wallerstein maybe that you were reading a little bit?
Yes.
Aha.
Yes.
That's the other world systems theory. He's he kind of names it that.
Okay.
And then the cycles of accumulation is Riggy, but that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that it came from engineering, but I would say like.
No, it didn't come from engineering. It just came from this, the idea of systems theory, which I mean, it's not. Yeah, I guess it's more like maybe science or.
Sure.
So not really. Engineering.
And like our conversation so far has ranged from energy to Ecotopia to role-playing games to science fiction TV shows. So like this is how it's worlds, and being able to kind of like build, map, understand worlds is kind of central to my interest too. So I am not, in some ways I'm adherent to disciplinary boundaries, but other ways like not whatsoever. And
but pretty much whatever we've discussed so far like are essential sort of tools to world building. Like you're talking about language, talking about political economy, and role-playing games are actually a pretty big part of that. So I think because it's essentially a digital twin or a simulator of like what you'd wish the world to be, and then you have your players in the game that are trying to because in the end it's all about humans, so you're trying to figure out how humans think, and there's no better digital sort of twin or simulator than a role-playing game. So that's cool. My next question was going to why you chose world system theory, but you answered that already. So what are the 4 sort of successive cycles of capital? Because I think you mentioned, you mentioned Arrighian's model, how the model treats capital as a world system that changes in a spatio-temporal way. So I think you briefly mentioned the cycles.
So according to Arrighi, the first cycle is in Genoa. And that's like the long 17th century.
Okay.
And then you have the Dutch cycle. And then you have the British cycle, long 19th century. And then you have the US cycle. And then there's tons of speculation. Like there's this kind of divide where some people are thinking like another cycle is happening, which would place China as the hegemon. And Arrighi actually has a whole book about that. Other people argue that we're in what's known as secular stagnation, which essentially says that though we can produce more wealth, there's no, like capital can't reproduce itself anymore. Which is like a kind of mind-bending thing to wrap one's head around. Like people have poetically described it as like vapor fumes, value fumes, not vapor fumes. That's the same thing. Value fumes, like they just sort of running on empty. But that's like there's people since the 80s who've been kind of arguing that there's going to be a terminal crisis that ends this global system of accumulation, or that destroys us in the process, or anyhow. I'm just sort of sketching that out to say that there is debate within the worlds that of kind of like Marxist political economy that try to sort these things out. So those cycles are helpful in order to sort of explain financial crises, or to try to anticipate what might happen next, in terms of volatility. And I don't know, my friend Jeff, dear friend Jeff Diamante, I've been thinking about a thing. He actually made me write this in a paper, but it's like, the French, there's this French saying, ça plus change la même chose, like the more things change, the more they stay the same. He got me to say things don't change, they only get different. I think that's like the core thing of world systems theory in its most pessimistic or Arighian cycles of accumulation. Like you're kind of seeing a repeated thing, a repeated pattern happening again and again, which has a toll. I don't know if that helps answer that.
No, it does. In other words, just I guess so more things change, more stay the same, but it's more like, I wouldn't really say same, but similar, but in a different either setting or a slightly different way. So there's some kind of evolution, but at the fundamentals, like if you look at the fundamentals, it's very much the same as it was before. So
kind of works for the expanse. I mean, it's so aesthetically, it's so different being in space. There's all these things, but then they're also like there's these callbacks. So the ship is the Rocinante, which is like nodding back to Cervantes and Don Quixote, and that kind of they're like, this is an adventure. Like you're also, as much as it's political and worth thinking through, it's there are these other nods in there too.
Okay. So you discuss, I mean, I kind of briefly talked about systemic cycles of accumulation, and that's where it comes from Arrighian's model. This is actually a concern sort of among some thinkers in the crypto sort of economic space sector. So there is this fear that we've sort of like replicated the past analog political economic models into, so-called big tech today, and that we may be doing it again in crypto economic systems, like, so especially when it comes to governance mechanisms. So could you probably maybe explain systemic cycles of accumulation, how that sort of, I guess, relates to us today? Because, we pretty much, I'd say we've discussed it already.
Well, there's one thing I would look. It's sort of it's weirdly personal in that in December I decided for whatever reason to put together a new desktop, and it was really hard to find a video card.
Okay.
And that was because of like supply shortages and the quarantine, but also because of cryptocurrency mining. The rigs, like I remember looking up the rigs that are built to do this, and just all the GPUs stacked and stacked and stacked and stacked. And so it's tying it back in, like this is part of a smaller cycle of capital accumulation where you need to build the fixed capital, like all the computers that that will do that process,
Mm-hmm.
and they're also all they running on energy. So I'm just like, there's been lots of stories too about the carbon footprint of cryptocurrency. It's like, I can see not necessarily the long like macro scale of this, but I can also see how certain things are repeating themselves and intensifying with like, there hasn't been a year where we've used less energy than the year before in modern history.
Yeah, it's true. Like it was huge. There's a huge sort of reset for the planet. Like you saw all these images of things sort of like getting cleaned up because of, humans weren't even, we're all cooped up in our, homes and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I guess so. Like, because from the crypto aspect, like you have, because proof of work is what we're talking about when you're talking about capital accumulation and getting those rigs, because proof of work works in a way where miners have to solve a cryptographic hash, essentially puzzle, and that is highly dependent on your hardware. So it's tied to your hardware. So it's supposed to be like the purest form or closest to the purest form of meritocracy when it comes to governance, because anyone, but obviously over time, that actually oddly over time that ends up being more centralized, and people who have more capital are able to, like dominate in the space. So right now, in the case of Bitcoin, you have most of your mining, most miners are, I think there's two of the largest miners, F2 Pool or something, and another one, but they're like the two largest miners. So it's essentially, from the miners' perspective, it's tended towards centralization. But you can still decentralize a system as long as you have people holding nodes. So they're not necessarily miners, but like they just hold a node. But in essence, they're not really, I guess, it's more like they're securing the network, but they're not participating in sort of the consensus mechanism, which is the proof of work. But then you have, so most of the talk about crypto is really related to that proof of work. And it is, but there's also this other thing called proof of stake, which is actually very similar, oddly very similar to our systems of capital and governance as we have today. And the idea is that you can stake the crypto that you own, but instead of using hardware to verify a hash, it's just a validator. It's just validating that that sort of node exists. So that's a lot better. Or when it comes to environment, like there's not much computation power associated with that. But in the end, it's still a form of systemic capital accumulation of capital, right? Because nodes that have a lot more sort of crypto staked in their validator tend to have more power as such to like do validations and all that kind of stuff. So I think and that's sort of like this this concern, like, are we replicating the same things? They just look different. Like the proof of work actually is probably more different to, probably out of the two, proof of work is probably more different to what we have in terms of governance mechanisms, and probably more meritocratic. But of course now it's just, there's emergence in every complex system. So but yeah, I mean, so that's, I guess that's the whole sort of discussion in like what is the solution to not repeating the past, really. So I guess that's it. Yeah. So that's what. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the way that you put the like. I mean, it's just true, but like, there's always emergent properties in complex systems, and even this. I'm not gonna repeat what you said, but we just said about how do you solve non-repeating past. Like, I guess in some way we can think about, you're giving me a way to think through the work that I've been doing over the last 5 or 10 years as kind of like just like different humanistic angles on similar questions, like an intervention into language or role-playing games. Like they're all kind of trying to grapple with both of those things. there's a great historian, Hayden White, who really argued, kind of like in the 80s, that historians weren't doing a kind of neutral work. They were writing narratives. And many people were mad about this. But one of the great things that he said about this kind of work that we're sort of like talking about, and the kind of work we're doing in the article, is like, the question is, how does historical change take place? Right? It's like, and it's a kind of revelation for me to hear it put in a way that I'm less familiar with, to hear that, to like thinking about, how do you solve non-repeating history, or deal with those emergent properties? Because I think that's, in a sense, science fiction is kind of like about trying to figure out what those emergent properties might be. To be ready for them. Before the call, you were talking about corporate entities that were basically becoming like not multinational but metanational even. And I wonder if you've read the 90s trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, the Mars trilogy.
No, I've heard of it, but no, I haven't.
I didn't read it until a couple of years ago. And a lot of the stuff that some of the science is outdated now, and he's sort of like, some of these things can't be true, but it's about 100. The first book, Red Mars, is about the first 100 scientists that go to Mars to set up a Martian colony. And so Earth is always at a remove, but and it's about the kind of similar struggles that we see in The Expanse taking place on the surface of Mars. And the metanational interests want to build a space elevator so they can extract minerals from the planet much more readily. And people on Mars, there's people who are resisting that. Some people want to keep it the way it is, and they're called the Reds. Some people want to terraform it, and they're called the Greens. Some people are like, well, what about aeroformation, which would be like letting Mars become what it wants to become. It's a super complex but wonderful trilogy of novels. I highly recommend.
Okay, cool. I'll get started on that. So could you explain to us Anthropocentrism from the perspective of The Expanse? I don't know if I pronounced that right, but because I think this is something we see today in the space sector, where you have actors that treat space, when they say want to colonize the moon or Mars or space tourism, they're looking at it from their perspective, but not necessarily question whether their perspective is the right one or is the only one. So
so like the idea of putting the human first, what does that mean in the context of space? I mean, just to complicate the question a little bit, I would say even like, which humans get to do this? Who gets to go into space, and why is that possible? I don't know. I'm thinking about that Elon Musk rocket that he was trying to get to go, and then it landed and then exploded 2 seconds later or something. Like
I think he
resources.
He recently got it working. So
okay.
I think they finally, I think it's the 5th try, but
I guess I'm only paying attention to the screw ups or something, So what I think there's just this way that so much of the world shaped around us influence us to see things from this human first perspective, and makes sense given our kind of daily needs. So it's cultural, but I think it's biological in some ways too. Not to say that it's an essential quality, but I think there's this is another thing that an Ecotopian Lexicon kind of pushes back against. Even The Expanse in some ways asks us to think outside of that, of the human, and to sort of I mean, it might even be that when we say anthropocentric, it's funny. We say anthropocentric, or we also talk about like consumer choices for environmental impacts of consumer choices, right? So it's like it's either all of us or just a few of us, like on an individual level, that are at the problem, which kind of misses the whole middle band of things. In terms of carbon footprint or emissions or development, or even how we look out at space. It's I get the feeling from your podcast, from our conversation, that we probably have similar thinking about this, or at least mostly similar, in that I have this deep love of space exploration, of imagining what could be beyond the Earth. And yet I'm also kind of skeptical and cynical of how we're going about pursuing that future.
There's actually quite from the context of space, like for the space sector, there are quite a few people researching and questioning that perspective that you're talking about, like we're optimistic to go to other places. We don't want to we don't want to repeat or like do a carbon copy of what we do on Earth somewhere else, and it's essentially the same thing we're talking about before, like in crypto. It's kind of the same thing. So whatever we're doing, we just have to make sure that we just don't repeat what we did in the past. Like when it comes to colonization, we don't want to do that again. So what is the best sort of, we have, and that's really like actually the episode I put out this month was on ethics, space ethics, and was trying to figure out, so it was this Dr. Erica Nesvold, and she's trying to figure out what questions we need to ask when it comes to ethics, like when we're going out into settlement. And like she done like a podcast, a limited series podcast on making new worlds, and how should we like look at space settlement, because you can't really call it space colonization, because then you're inferring to, because there's a lot of like weight in that word colonization, especially historically for a lot of cultures. So want to reframe it as settlement, and then space settlement, what does that involve, like what the ethics associated with it? I mean, there's definitely people thinking about it, and definitely people like skeptical about it, and like making sure that we try and do the best we can when we come up with the questions, as well as try and answer them. So cool. So is there a book or a podcast or anything? So I think you've given quite a few recommendations already, like some like Mars, and then a few others, and so far we've talked about. But is there anything, I guess, you could give our listeners about your work, like a book or a podcast or anything like?
Well, but if it's about my work, I would definitely love to say that just this week, I got in the mail a copy of my own book, called Remainders of the American Century.
Oh, nice.
Post-apocalyptic novels in the age of U.S. decline. So it also engages with cycles of accumulation, but through the lens of a kind of blasted Earth, post-apocalyptic Earth. There is a chapter on the frontier in here, the sort of 1980s frontier of David Brin's The Postman and Kim Stanley Robinson's The Wild Shore. That'll be out in June. So not about it, kind of like the failure of the American project in some ways, this book. But I would also, I recommended the Mars trilogy, and I would also recommend for a kind of totally different space exploration trilogy, Needy Okorafor's Binti. It is, there's a ship that is basically like an interstellar crustacean, like a shrimp.
Right.
It's very cool. It's very cool.
Okay.
Needy Okorafor's Binti is, so it's the first book in 3 short novellas.
Okay.
I would also recommend that.
Okay, cool. So before we conclude, where can listeners reach out to you?
You can tweet at me. I'm at is a grapefruit. That's IS a grapefruit. My website is just my full name, Brent Ryan Bellamy.com. And there's a contact form there, so send me email. Cool. I'm happy to be in touch. Vikram, thank you so much for
thanks for taking the time. It was really, and I highly also recommend that article if you guys like solar accumulations. It's definitely worth a read. So thanks, Brent, for coming on Clean Space. Until next time, stay safe out there, and thanks for your time. See you soon.
Cheers.
See you. If you've made it all the way to the end of the show, then a really big thank you. If you're interested in being a patron for the show, you can find Claiming Space on Patreon, Anchor, and Audius platforms, where you can contribute as little as $1, as this would help with improving the show. I appreciate the time you've taken to listen to this episode and hope there's some informative content for you. If you'd like to hear more, suggest improvements or guests, please let me know via the website's feedback form. If you could please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, subscribe, like, rate, and review it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or any other platform you use, as this would help the algorithms and let people know we are out there. Until next time, see you later.